Oh, my camera's fuzzy. I'm sorry. Let me just swipe. There we go. Hello, everybody. My name is Naj Abdul Kawi. I am the Arts and Culture Director for Muslim Sisters Staten Island, as well as the founder and co-chair for GOASIcon. So I'm wearing two hats today. Boop, boop. So today we have a wonderful It's Taboo, Let's Talk. If you can see my little background here, that's a little banner of all the different things we talk about. So we talk about substance abuse, gender-based violence, mental health. But today we are talking about Black and Asian solidarity. What does that mean? What does it mean to be an ally? What does it mean, the history overall for Black and Asian solidarity, for Black people, for Asian people? What is that all about? So before I start, I want to introduce some of the panelists that we have here that were precious enough to give us their time. So the first person I will be introducing will be Billy Kim. Hello, Billy.
Hello, guys. Do I share a little bit about myself?
Yeah, you could share a little bit about yourself, who you are, what you do.
Well, pleasure to be here, and thank you for inviting me to the panel. I'm just a very humble pastor from a local church in New York City, downtown. I'm also a chaplain at NYU. Born and raised in Staten Island, so I have that connection here with you guys with that. And just now currently living in Chinatown in Manhattan. And so
nice. Awesome. Thank you so much, Billy. All right, I'm going to bring up the next person. All right, next up we have my lovely friend Cheyenne Clarity. Hello, Cheyenne. Oh no, the Cheyenne freeze. Technology. You know, guys, we love it, but we hate it at the same time. So while she gets her technology kind of all set up, next person I'm going to bring up will be Gareth Bryant. Hello, Gareth. Assalamu alaikum.
How are you?
I'm good. Alhamdulillah. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself, what you do, why you're here?
Sure. I'm Gareth Bryant. I'm a Muslim Afro-American, native New Yorker. I'm a chaplain, counselor, therapist, and I exist to make the uncomfortable comfortable.
Nice. I like that intro. All right, let's see how uncomfortable or how comfortable we make people for this conversation. Thanks. All right, let me bring up the next person. Let's bring up Clara Park. Hello, Clara.
Hi, everyone. Happy Saturday. My name is Clara Park. I am a native New Yorker, born and raised in Staten Island, like Billy. And I am a community advocate. Professionally and academically, my background is in international relations, public policy, and youth leadership. To just have a dialogue and really just make space for us to rebuild and see how we can move movement.
All right, awesome. Thank you so much, Clara. All right, so the next person we're going to bring up will be Hina Naveed. Assalamu alaikum, Hina.
Walaikum assalam. It's so wonderful to be here. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Hina Naveed. I am a registered nurse. I'm a recent law grad. I'm an immigrant rights activist. I have a lot of hats, as do most people here today. But the lens I'm bringing today is really the importance of working together. The same system that oppresses and detains immigrants is the same one that is incarcerating our Black brothers and sisters. And so for me, that's the lens I bring. This, a collaboration and partnership is more than it's a word, it's a verb, it's an action. And that's why I'm here today. So thank you so much for having me.
All right, thank you so much, Hina. That was well said. All right, so next up we are going to bring up, again, my lovely friend over here, Cheyenne Clarity. Hello, Cheyenne. Oh, you think you're muted? Oh yeah, you're muted. Unmute. Good. You got it? Is it unmuted?
Can you hear me?
There we go. Yeah. Again, we know the technology. Yeah, we can hear you. Yep. So tell us a little bit about yourself, Cheyenne, who you are, what you do.
Perfect. So I am the executive assistant for Muslim Sisters of Staten Island and also the co-con chair for GOASIcon. I am in. Can you hear me, Naja?
Yeah, I can hear you. Go ahead.
And so I am an activist, a mental health advocate, as well as a writer. So
Awesome. All right. Oh, and I forgot to fully introduce myself. I just like slid myself in here. I was like, hello, guys.
Yeah, so I am an activist, a writer. I work with Muslim Sisters of Staten Island as an executive assistant and as a co-con chair for GOASIcon.
Awesome.
And I am looking forward to this panel.
All right, awesome. Thank you so much. So I'm going to keep you on here because you're going to be the first person to present. But before that, I forgot to talk about other things that I do. So I also am what I call a baby activist, meaning in person being more active as opposed to just being virtually active. That's also kudos to Cheyenne here, who's my activist buddy here. We also try to put together other protests and events like this, either in person or virtually. So you will have a part 2 of whatever you see today. So Cheyenne, are you ready to do your presentation? I don't know. Maybe there's a slight lag. Might be a slight lag. Can you hear me, Cheyenne? Oh.
Yeah, I can.
Okay, are you ready to do your presentation? I'm about to pull it up right now. Okay, so let's share the screen. Okay. Hold on. I'm having technical issues. Okay, there we go. Boom, boom, boom. All right, so I'm going to be pulling up a nice presentation that was put together by Cheyenne, who's going to do a little bit of the history of Black and Asian solidarity. So let me share the screen. Present. Okay. Whenever you're ready to roll, Shy. Oh, I think there might be a little bit with her issue with her phone.
All right, just one second.
Yep. Sorry for the delay, everybody. Also, too, for those who are watching, if you think of any questions while you watch the presentation, while you hear any of the panelists talk, please feel free to comment on our Facebook and our YouTube channel. We really want to make sure that we hear what from our audience members, and if there's anything that we don't cover, that we can try our best to cover at today's event. But if we don't cover it today, we will cover it in our part 2, which will be happening in August. So what I can do is Shy while you try.
So just
are you ready?
Checking before I start. So hearing from the part.
Yes, I can hear you. You're good. There's a little bit of graininess, but I can hear you. It might be a bit delayed because of your Wi-Fi, but you're good.
Hi, everyone. This is Cheyenne. Yeah. So hi, everyone. So again.
Cheyenne, it's hard. I don't know if there's an issue with your Wi-Fi connection, but we can't hear you all of a sudden. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to have it where I just start the presentation. And once you have your Wi-Fi kind of more set up, I'm going to pass it back off to you, okay? So I'm going to pass it back off to you and I'll start the presentation. So I know it says by Cheyenne Clarity, but I'm taking over a little bit since she's having a bit of a Wi-Fi issues. So this is about the history of Black and Asian solidarity that our lovely panelist Cheyenne Clarity put together. So solidarity has been happening for a long time. It isn't something new that's just kind of been encompassing within the last, 4 or 5, even the last couple of months with certain things that are going on. So a great example of that is with Frederick Douglass in the 1800s, where there was the Chinese Exclusion Act. So it imposed restrictions on Chinese immigrants, urged Americans not to fear Asian language or cultures. It advocated for free immigration and equality and human rights. That's kind of what Frederick Douglass went with, as opposed to when the Chinese Exclusion Act was essentially saying anyone who was Chinese after a certain point in time could no longer come to the country because they're seen as, quote unquote, that same rhetoric of taking people's jobs, right? And there's a quote here that says, "It is this right to assert for the Chinese and Japanese all other varieties of men equally with yourself, now and forever. I know of no rights of race superior to the rights of humanity. And when there is supposed conflict between human and national rights, it is safe to go on the side of humanity." So that's kind of going to be the epitome of like what we're talking about this whole time. Is about humanity and looking at each other as humans as opposed to othering, right? So next we have it, we're talking about solidarity for Filipinos and people within the Vietnam War. So the Philippine, there we go, said it wrong, Philippine-American War, which is from 1899 to 1913. The U.S. gained colonial rule of the Philippines following the Spanish-American War in 1898. Ida B. Wells and Henry M. Turner supported the Philippine independence and viewed as an unholy war of conquest. Another way that there was solidarity between the two communities was during the Vietnam War, which is from 1955 to 1975. And that is when Black men were disproportionately drafted for the war. So 64% versus 31% of white Americans. So the racist ideology was a factor that was used in rhetoric in all of American society from the 50s to the 70s, meaning racist ideology shaped the reasons for escalating conflicts. So white soldiers in Vietnam wore KKK robes and carried Confederate flags to express superiority over the Vietnamese people. So even though a lot of times the KKK is associated with having a lot of oppression over Black people, they had a lot of oppression also too within different communities within Asia. Black soldiers also were questioned for the reasons of fighting in war. They deserted their positions and fought with the freedom fighters. So they were like, yeah, no, America's doing the wrong thing in this case. So they decided to fight with the Vietnamese instead. So many Black leaders called for solidarity, arguing that there were instruments to oppress other people of color by white leaders. Next is the Bandung Conference in 1955. The conference in Bandung, Indonesia was in, again, 1955, comprised of African, Asian, and Middle Eastern countries. It spoke about the third world's role in the Cold War. So economic growth, peaceful coexistence, decolonization, and many African countries were not independent during this time. So the idea of kind of being colonized was a universal concept, specifically during this era. The U.S. was also on the fence due to race relations in the country and the relationship with Europe, aka the colonizers. Let me go next. Oop, I didn't go next. There we go. So Grace Lee Boggs, who was born in 1955 and died in 2015, fought for tenants' rights. So she was a member of the Working Party that focused on liberation of all marginalized people and community building. She also worked alongside Black auto workers. Guys, I'm sorry, a little tired. Worked alongside like auto workers in Detroit to denounce the World War II, as well as MLK's like headlines. So she worked a lot with him, as well as contributed to Black-led Save Our Sons and Daughters, or SOSASD, and advocated against violence and conflict resolution curriculum in public schools in Detroit. Another great thing that she did was she worked with Malcolm X and provided Black to Stay when he delivered his message to grassroots speech. So I'm going to see if Cheyenne's internet is working and then have her hop on and maybe take the other half of this. Hi, Cheyenne. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Can you see the presentation just fine?
Yep, sure can.
All right, great. So I'm going to go on to the next slide. I'm going to pass it off to you. All right.
Already sounds good.
Awesome.
So you have Thich Nhat Hanh and Dr. Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. So Hanh was actually a Vietnamese Buddhist who met Martin Luther King in 1965 in Chicago. So both of them actually talked about peace as well as the idea of community with each other, which is one of the main themes that they've had. What is an interesting fact about this is, in fact, that they were not only good friends, that they were also, Martin Luther King decided that he would nominate Thich Nhat Hanh for the Nobel Peace Prize. Now, unfortunately, the Peace Prize wasn't happening during 1967, but it was just still the fact that he had been nominated. Now, just quickly, here's a quote. It says, "We have a discussion about peace, freedom, and community. And we agreed that without community, we cannot go very far." So this is what Thich Nhat Hanh actually had talked about with MLK Jr. during their time. Now, he actually talked about how grateful he was to talk to him because obviously the following year he was assassinated. Now, next is Yuri Kochiyama, who was born in 1921 to 1914. She was actually one of the many Japanese American internees that were taken to internment camps during World War II. After World War II, she had went to Harlem and supported the Young Lords, which is roughly Latinx, a Latinx activism group, and Harlem Community for Self-Defense. She actually founded the Asian Americans for Action. So I know they have had many events during this time, but she's the one that founded it. In 1963, she actually had met Malcolm X, which radicalized her activism and was actually the one cradling his head when he was shot and killed. So lastly, she was the one that fought for liberation and also for reparations for Japanese Americans. So next is the Third World Liberation Front. So this was an activism group that was in San Francisco State University. Now, they actually birthed a number of other events that had gone, or a number of activism events that had gone on during this time. They actually had saw that their Black counterparts had created a Black student union, which fought for more admissions within the university. Now, this actually, they encouraged the Third World Front Liberation, so before they were created, to create their own Students of Color coalitions, which is what created the Third World Liberation Front. They had noticed that there was a lack of admission for Asian and Latinx students, so they had fought the administration and faculty to have more faculty members that were people of color, as well as for more admissions. Now, one of the best things that actually ended up happening throughout creating this coalition was that they had birthed more of these fronts. Like, for example, in UC Berkeley, many of the Black students had joined forces with the Mexican American Student Coalition, one for Asian Americans, Native American Alliance, to advocate and focus on these programs. Now, here's an interesting fact that the goal was to actually create a third world college, which was to focus on identity and oppression. Okay, so next is the Asian and Black Solidarity 5K run. Now, originally, this run was to celebrate the 29th anniversary of the Black and Korean riots in LA. So this is during the time of Rodney King. So many Asian Americans were putting their lives on the line for the Black Lives Matter revolution. So we have seen a lot of solidarity from Asian Americans during the Black Lives Matter movement. Now, Black Americans, for example, are doing the same for Asian American elders in terms of traveling. So many of them have actually escorted Asian American elders to their homes or to wherever they were going. Now, even though I'm not going to show this, there was this article that says 75 ways Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders were speaking out for Black lives. And one of the examples was for the South Asian youth in Houston. So this was to talk about how South Asians can act in solidarity within the Black community, and also created this thing called Fighting Anti-Blackness, which includes podcasts, readings, and resources. The second example was the Vietnamese Solidarity in Action Network, which is a 2-hour virtual panel with 24 speakers that are having a conversation on racism and the BLM movement. Now, some of their conversations talked about how to talk to their families about racism and pushing for systemic change. Now, I'm not going to show this because of time. This is just an example of the Black and Asian Solidarity 5K run in 2021. This ended up originally being one where they would be running, but because there was such a huge turnout, they ended up having people walking for the most part, and it just became a rally. And that pretty much concludes our presentation, but just know that solidarity has been done and will continue to happen, especially during this climate. Anything is possible.
Thank you so much, Cheyenne, for doing that part of the presentation. I know you were having a little bit of Wi-Fi issues, so I'm pretty sure I did not do the first part of the presentation justice, but if anybody wants access to our presentation, please let us know and we'll send it your way for you to be able to look at, and also, you know, grab some of that knowledge that we have here. So next, we will bring up all of our lovely panelists that you heard introduce themselves and have our community conversation. So first, I'll bring up Billy Kim. Hello. Gareth Bryant. Hey, hey, hey. Bring up Clara Park. Making sure I bring up the right Clara Park because there's 2 Clara Parks here. And then Hina Naveed is having she will be right back. She just had to step out for a second so we can get started on our conversation. Okay, so let me bring up the first, actually, maybe ask you guys your first question. What do you guys think about the presentation and hearing a little bit of the history between Black and Asian solidarity? Anybody can go first.
I think the history is very important. Unfortunately, a lot of Afro-Americans and a lot of Asian Americans, not just within the United States, but within the entirety of the Western Hemisphere, a lot of Afro-Americans and Asian Americans don't really know that type of history in which they piggybacked off of each other's activism and helped each other mightily. This type of history is not really taught as it should be in school. Even on the college level, it's not really taught that diligently. And I know the reason why. It's because when an oppressor wants to keep people divided, they put things in the mix to make them seem as though they're better or worse than each other. And it gives them the illusion that they one-up each other. So let's say, for example, when Irish immigration or Italian immigration, Anglo society, they often pinned the Irish American against the Italian American because it benefited Anglo society prior to the Irish American and the Italian American being allowed to acquire whiteness. So each new wave of immigration, they've been used to be pinned against other types of peoples. And the tension between Afro-Americans or Asian Americans is literally no different. This is done purposely to deflect from the reality that both Afro-Americans and Asian Americans have the same oppressor, which is white supremacy, right? And, you know, ironically, one of the things that people don't talk about in terms of Afro-Asian solidarity is that one of the most cruelest ways that African Americans and Asian Americans are portrayed in the media is through sex culture, sexual fetishism via pornography. That alone is something that needs to be on the discussion, amongst other things, about how Afro-Americans or Asian Americans are typecast and stereotyped and pigeonholed into certain spheres or certain prototypes, and they're only deemed to be these types of like gangster roles or submissive roles or weak roles. All of these things are very calculative and very deliberate. And then also, let's say, for example, in urban communities where a lot of Asian businesses are allowed to thrive, this is done systematically to put a check and balance against the growth of Afro-American communities. And because of this tension, obviously with the whole quote unquote model minority myth, this gives Asian Americans like the illusion of like one-upping Afro-American or Latino people, and then it causes resentment against Asian Americans by Afro and Latino people. So if you want to really talk about solidarity, those are kind of like the core things that have to be put on the table for discussion about how and why we allow the same oppressor to keep playing the same game and we keep falling for the same tricks.
No, that was some really good points you made there, Gareth. Thank you. Billy, do you want to say anything, add to what Gareth said?
Yeah, I mean, first, Cheyenne, great presentation, both of you guys. Thank you. Gareth, just want to bounce off of what you're saying too. I think personally, as a Korean American, when my parents immigrated here in the 70s, one of the first Koreans in Staten Island, and so like my parents experienced or I have grown up with the model minority myth. They had a deli up on the Upper East Side and around the Harlem area, and they experienced that systemic racism and prejudice against the Black and Latino community. And so I find that to be really important where we understand the history of Asian and Black solidarity, because for me growing up, and especially in Staten Island, which is, as you guys know, can be very, very insular and very racist in many ways. I did not know the history. I had to really dig through it. And I was reinforced a lot with the American system and the public school system of what history is supposed to be like. And so specifically, not just as an Asian, but as a Korean and a Korean American, we, not majority, but many of us have gone to be deli owners in that area. We struggled to experience that tension and that racism and those lies. So again, going back to the original question, the history is so very, very important, and especially for my perspective and change as well.
Thank you so much, Billy. That's good, right? Because like we have all of us here from those communities, right? So we have both our personal experiences, but also like our, overall what we see happening within our community, because we're all very active in our communities, or at least we try our best to be, right? And to see like what's going on and the things that they're facing. Clara, I don't know if you're able to talk. I know she's having some webcam issues, but do you want to talk a little bit about anything in essence of the presentation that me and Cheyenne did, or kind of touching on the kind of just the overall topic of like Black and Asian solidarity?
Yep. Okay. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Great. Yeah, no, I mean, I echo what Gareth and Billy mentioned. The history is something that is not what we're taught in school. We aren't taught that at all. And even when we learn about Asian American history, and if we learn about Black history, those moments of solidarity are not often highlighted. It's very much, I took some classes, when I was in my undergrad on Asian American history and even just Black history in general. And that's not where I learned it, even though I took so many classes on critical race theory. There was one class where, where the professor really highlighted it, and he actually wrote a book on it. So we touched upon it there, but it's not something that's taught growing up, right? So I feel like the average person does not have this information, right? And it's only now coming up with more of social media, with just even more media attention, and with blogs, just being lots of people writing blogs about the history of Black and Asian solidarity. So it's something that, coming from a youth development perspective, I know that there are community-based organizations that are also working to, really go into the public school system and build curriculum that teaches Asian American history, but also Afro and Asian solidarity in schools, right? So that kids know their history, they understand and grow up with this, and not learn it as an adult, right? When it's much harder to kind of unlearn many of the things that we have grown up with.
You made a really good point there, Clara, right? Like unlearning things as an adult or even as like a teenager, right? Because that's 10, 20, 30 plus years of learning the same thing over and over again, or having the same kind of rhetoric kind of pushed down our throats, right? Or like tell us like, hey, this is what this is, and you have to accept what this is, and there's no other alternative, there's no other story, there's no other truth, right? And even kind of go back to Gareth's point, right, about kind of like the white supremacy being the basis of a lot of these things. They're saying to us like, hey, this is what this is. These people are bad. These people are good. These people are this. These people are that. And then having that aha moment as an adult can be kind of weird, which like, wait a minute, but I thought for my whole life that things are supposed to be this way, and then have that kind of realization. And then when you do have the realization, try and help others around you to have that realization can also be a difficult thing as well, to have them be on the same page as you, because you just now, let's say, right, figured it out, right? Or you just now have, took off the rose-colored glasses. And now you're like, wait, everybody got to take off their rose-colored glasses too. So that was a really good point. Cheyenne, do you want to talk about anything as one of the people that did the presentation, and then we'll move on to the next question?
Sure. So for me, as someone who's an activist, I can actually admit that there was a lot that I didn't know as far as Black and Asian solidarity. And for someone like myself, who's actually spent the last, almost decade having to relearn and unlearn a lot of these things, I actually found it shocking but then not surprising, that a lot of these things were not taught. Because the moment when you have people that are actually on the same page and are actually unifying, it's pretty much an like, now how do we properly divide and conquer? Again, you can't do that once the reality and the histories are actually being taught and discussions are being had. But outside, like, if you are not in an activism or radical activist circle where people actually know this type of information and have these type of resources, you're not going to know. The average person just does not know these things. And even for myself, I had to take classes in college in order for me to learn some of the history. And that was not even some. That was probably a little tiny little fraction of what we really should be knowing. But here we are, having to pretty much learn about these things on our own, or just having like somebody, just saying, hey, here's a random fact, or here's something that you should know. That it should not be a thing. But we really do need to talk about our the American school system, like the education system, the way how it is, which gears towards not only white supremacy, but this Western and Americanized dominance, where certain histories are not taught because that means that it's not included. So there's that sense of otherism that prevents us from actually understanding our culture and actually being proud of our respective cultures.
Yeah, no, that's really true. I think a lot of us are touching on like kind of like a lot of the same basis of like education and being given this information, because some people are like history buffs and they love learning about history, and they love learning about things. And some people, it's like, unless you make it engaging enough or make it seem like it's something interesting, it can sound like it's a fantasy, right? The presentation that we just did could seem like we just threw some things together and been like, oh, wow, did you know these two people knew each other and these two people did this, this, and this? And it's like, whoa, I never heard about that. Are you sure? Because I wasn't taught that in class. So it's like that kind of, again, pushing the truth, which should be the narrative, but isn't. So actually, this goes up to a follow-up question. So what has contributed to both communities' prejudices and hate towards each other? And what are some of the underlying causes of tension? Who would like to be the first person to tackle that? Yeah, Billy, like, whoa. Let me see.
I would say I would say one particular thing is even on the subject of reparations, how certain Asian communities were reparated as a result of Anglo-American aggression, whereas Afro-Americans have been here longer than any of those Asian American groups and have gotten zero reparations. That particular thing alone is something that gives rise to a lot of tension, because a lot of Asian American communities, especially those who historically have been Anglo-reparated, have been rather silent in terms of the how should I say, the pontification or the promotion of Afro reparations. And like it just is a conversation that is not has not happened. And it's almost like a, well, I got mine, you got to get yours type of thing. It's like, no, it's like we were oppressed too. It's not, you know what I'm saying, that type of thing. And also, I would say in terms of like the early history of Afro-Asian solidarity is that was purposely thwarted in many ways by the US government's allowance of the reopening of the doors of mass immigration starting from the late 1960s. Because what ended up happening is that when the vast majority of a lot of communities, particularly Asian communities, started to be allowed to immigrate en masse in the United States, being as though they were just as much of a significant majority as Afro-Americans, yeah, it made sense for them to have common interest and for them to be more in solidarity. But as their numbers grew, they were able to align themselves with each other. And it's almost like many of them left the joint struggle that Afro-Americans and Asian Americans had because they have the same oppressor. They left that struggle. A lot of people, I'm not going to say everyone, but a lot of people from these respective communities, they chose the go along to get along narrative. They literally chose the model minority narrative. And Afro-Americans are like, wait a minute, what the hell happened? Like, y'all got yours, what about ours? And a lot of people from these communities was like, sayonara. they you know what I'm saying? So they're like, yo, you got to get yours on your own type of thing. You know, so, and that didn't happen instantaneously. That was a process that occurred over time. And unfortunately, that process is still happening. And when we talk about Asian Americans, we're not just talking about people from China, Mongolia, North and South Korea, Vietnam, Thailand. We're talking about people from the Indian subcontinent. We're talking about people from Iran. We're talking about people from the Arab world, because the Arab world predominantly historically is in the Asian continent, like the principal Arab countries, the Gulf states, all of these people from these places, the Levant, Palestine, Syria, these are Asian Americans also. So these types of people also who are Asian Americans, they jumped on the same go along to get along bandwagon also. And in fact, after 9/11, there were a lot of Arab activists. They have a signature slogan called "We're white without the privilege," because of the onslaught of xenophobia that they have faced and still face in a post 9/11 world. Whereas prior to that, many of them, not all of them, but many of them recognized the reality that we all have one thing in common. Well, two things in common. Number one, we're human beings. Number two, we have the same modern day oppressor. But when you're given crumbs from the master's table, you allow yourself to forget that you're inherently just as oppressed as another person. But when you get the crumbs from the master's table, you allow yourself to have amnesia, and you allow yourself to forget, and you distance yourself from a struggle that you have just as much of a stake in as anyone else.
Wow. I got a history lesson, and I got like that was like a mic drop. Clara, do you wanna jump on anything that Gareth said or add on?
I just want to touch on what you just said about how people get amnesia, and quite frankly, it happens within our communities too, right? Once people gain some economic status, they maybe climb up the ladder, they climb up the corporate ladder, they are attaining a certain amount of wealth. People also forget, like even within our own communities, right? They're not fighting for people who are who have just come here, newer immigrants, or people who are in the working class, or people who are just small business owners, right? the top 1%, right, forgets. And we see that in Black American communities as well. And that's something that has to do with class and economic status, which is also a whole other discussion, I think. But it's just interesting, I echo like that there's amnesia, between the communities, but also within, people forget even within what's really important, how to fight for their own communities, to fight for the people who are the most marginalized within our own communities. And so it's really difficult, I also wanted to add that I think that even when we're asking like what is the source of tension, right? What are some of the sources of tension? I'll just say straight up, right? There's anti-Blackness within the Asian community. Anti-Blackness and racism exists against Black people and other communities of color within our community, as well as against, between nations, right? So between East Asian groups and Southeast Asian groups and South Asian groups. And that's been changing over the last several years as more and more of the younger generation, of Asian Americans are speaking out, they're standing up. But there's still a lot of work to be done. And so I think, it's a major, anti-Blackness is just a major source of that tension, right, that exists between the two communities. And it's just something that we have to eradicate and continue to work on. And I am seeing that a lot more these days of Asian American activists who are really centering Black voices, who are bringing it back to, hey, if we allow the model minority myth to cause division, we all lose, right? We're not free until everybody is free. And I'm really proud of the Asian American activists who are doing that and centering, bringing us back to that narrative, because there's lots of background noise going on right now of just different ideas on how to address the recent, increased attacks on Asian Americans throughout the country and globally. And one of the narratives is a call for increased policing, which we all know that it is increased policing means that all of our communities suffer, right? So it's not just Black communities and communities of colors, it's Asian Americans suffer as well. And so, I know that is a source of pain and tension too, right? It's okay. I think from the Black American perspective, watching Asian Americans like call for increased policing, that's not the answer to this, right? And then people, might be like, okay, you want more police, like that goes completely against what what I stand for, right? So we're not on the same page about how to fight racism and just to move the movement forward. So yeah, I just wanted to touch on those. There's obviously much more, but touching on that and building off of what Garrett said.
Yeah, no, that was a good point to me. Billy, do you want to say anything before we move on to our next question?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things is our insularity. And I want to touch on our insularity. I mean, as human beings, we are insular by nature, and specifically, I would say specifically in the Korean community, we can be incredibly insular in many ways, and for many reasons. It's not to shit on our parents or the first generation. All they wanted to do is survive. A little context is for the people that actually immigrated, Korean people that immigrated in the 70s and 80s. Majority of them were professionals in Korea, but because of the economic struggle, they emigrated in the U.S. hoping for a better life, and they were limited with options. They were limited in terms of what they could do as a profession. So, they ended up becoming small business owners, like laundromat owners and deli owners, and they could only find it in the very poor socioeconomic background. Mind you, if you talk to a lot of those owners, they actually graduated from like the Harvards of Korea, and the Harvards and Yales of Korea. And so like that's their background. And unfortunately, because of that, the only encounter and experience that they have is from Black and other POC people that are, that just rob them or steal from them, from those socioeconomic status. And that colored in their bias, and that colors in us, their kids. So as we're growing up, because they want us to succeed, they want higher mobility, which everybody wants, right? That's you want your kids to succeed. And if they only see a certain particular experience with a certain particular socioeconomic group, and that's what you're limited to, you just create a generalization, right? And that's what happened to me. That's happened to many of my Korean American friends, and some Asian American friends. I can't speak for all, but that's the majority of the cause and attention of it, which Gareth talked about, which adds the model minority myth, which received with the systemic racism, which no one really comes in and realizes like, oh yeah, we're going to understand the system. No, we're like, we just need to survive. And I think that's what we find ourselves in, and those small, not so small, but hidden underlying tensions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I get that. That's also like, I think you all have made like a really good point, and actually segues into our next question, which is like, define the model minority myth. Is it the concept of the model minority myth helpful or harmful to the AAPI community? I'm about to bring it right back to you, Billy, because you touched on it a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, is it helpful or harmful to the AAPI community? I mean, overall, it is harmful for our society and us as American citizens. I would say for some, people believe in it because it drives them to work harder. Clearly, we don't often see the privilege that we have, or or how we are being pitted against each other in many ways. But I would not my stance, but I know for some they would say it's actually very helpful for them. And I want to put that there so that we could create more dialogue and conversation.
Do you?
Yeah, and I think
yeah.
I think yeah, for people who it's helpful for, right? I mean, for lack of a better word, we can say that they're asleep, right? Like their eyes are closed to what's actually going on. And actually, in the sense, I could see it being helpful in the sense where, as I mentioned earlier, people who have attained a certain amount of, wealth, economic status, and have maybe climbed the corporate ladder, they're looking out for their best interests, right? And so they're under the guise thinking, hey, this is going to get me closer to whiteness. I can attain the power and privilege, in this way, as long as I keep my head down, I do my work, I'm quiet, I'm hardworking. But we see that even within the corporate sector too, right? Like that actually doesn't happen. The Asian American men statistically, they do not actually climb up the corporate ladder that well in terms of getting promotions. They're not actually rewarded, if you will, for their achievements or their work that they're contributing to, within a corporation or a corporate company. Like they're oftentimes not. And then on the other hand, you have Asian American, specifically East Asian American women that actually do far better, right? And so, I mean, if we go back to defining the model minority myth, it's an idea that's rooted in white supremacy, right? It's the idea that there's a certain racial group that is an ultimate example of how a minority group should assimilate and behave within a system of white supremacy. And so in the context of the US, the model minority is the Asian American community. And it's used in two different ways, right? It's used one way, it's used as a tool of white supremacy to oppress Asian Americans ourselves, right? You create the illusion that by being the model minority, you can advance yourself within the structure and ultimately, as I mentioned, attain the same power and privilege as white people. And so, it puts whiteness at the center. It says, if you're doing everything that you're supposed to be doing, you will get to that point. Of course, that's an illusion. It's a facade, right? In reality, no matter how good we are, no matter how hard we try, we cannot attain the same power and privilege as white people, because at the end of the day, we are not white. And The second way that it's used is, we've touched on this earlier too, it's used to create division amongst communities of color. You put the model minority, the Asian American community, on a fake pedestal and say, hey, you should be like them. You should try hard. They can do it. Why can't you? Right. And that's often used against Black Americans. White supremacy says if you behave like they do, the good minority, then you also can get the same. You can make it. You can get the American dream. Right. Yeah.
Yeah, no, you made some really good points. It's kind of like back to that, like, pull yourself by the bootstrap, narrative where it's like, oh, well, this person did or this group did it. Why can't you guys do? Why are you guys having such a hard time? Why this? Why that? Why this? Not realizing that a lot of the barriers that come about were things that we didn't put in place, right? Weren't things that we, made a barrier for ourselves. And I do agree with you, Claire, kind of like the illusion, right? Where it's like the oasis, like in the desert, like, oh, wow, there's a oasis here. And like, I can drink and I can feed myself. And you get there, you're like, whoa, it was a mirage, like there was really nothing there. And I've spent all this time trying to achieve this thing that in, totality is not, tangible. So that was, you made some really good points there. Thank you, Clara. Anybody else want to touch up on this question before we move to the next one?
Yeah, so I really respect your honesty in terms of your breakdown of the fallacy of the model minority mythos, the pseudo narrative, because there's a lot of people, they're not going to have your type of honesty. They're just not. And even if they know what you know, if not more, very few people are going to be as honest as you two have been. So I really respect and appreciate your honesty. That's number one. Number two, in terms of the whole, like what you mentioned about the pedestal that they say, oh, like, okay, it's just like a stepping stone. That pedestal is purposely placed on the neck of another human being. So they're like, oh, well, I don't care if that person's neck get broke. I'm gonna step on the pedestal and get mine. And then also what Naja had mentioned about how people always say, oh, just pull your stuff up by your bootstraps. How am I supposed to pull myself up by my bootstraps when you cut off my feet? You know what I'm saying? Like, it's a known fact that the feet of certain communities have been cut off, and then they're complaining that we can't stand up and walk on our own 2 feet. You can't walk if you ain't got no feet. And as soon as certain types of communities at certain points in their history have tried to get a leg up, their legs have been cut off. But as a new wave of different types of people came in, those new people were allowed to step on the necks of the former people. And just like you mentioned, even interethnically, that happens also. Like, even like, for example, Afro people from the Caribbean or Afro people from Latin America, when they come into the United States, they're given the same pedestal that other groups have had to place on the neck of Afro peoples native to the United States to step on their necks. And just like you mentioned, like different waves of the same types of people, they're used as like kind of like cannon fodder so that other people can climb up the ladder, not the ladder of success, because that's an illusion. What it really is, the ladder to whiteness. Because you could be successful in the United States realistically without trying to chase the whiteness bag. But in the United States, it's like they try to present success like you can't be successful without trying to be white or trying to attain whiteness. And people always buy into that. So that's also a problem. And also what was mentioned prior is that even among Afro-Americans, you have people who become affluent, become wealthy, become powerful in their own right, but they don't give back to their own communities. They methodically, deliberately don't empower their own communities. And that by itself is another problem also, because I tell people all the time, you don't have to be European to be a white supremacist. And unfortunately, there's a lot of Afro peoples who are white supremacists based on their character, based on their behavior, based on the fact that they are direct contributors to the degradation of Afro peoples.
Yeah, that's a good point, and that all of you guys have made, like, especially about like kind of like the interethnic, right? Kind of like the concept of like colorism, like trying to be like the lighter you are, the better looking you are, the more successful you'll be, and the more attractive you are. Like, all of those things kind of comes back to again like running this race right towards whiteness, but with the idea that that means that you're going to be, successful. So you guys made some really good point. Yeah, really, yeah.
Yeah, I want to add to that too, because especially with the rising, hate crimes that are happening with the Asian community, that interethnic issue really happened because as I was talking to my parents and with even the Korean community, I was like, so how do you guys feel about it? They go, oh, it's the Chinese people that are getting harassed. It's not the Korean people. And so, and I think that's important to know. It's actually really important to know because Asian is very broad. And Gareth, you talked about it. There's a difference between like Caribbean black and like there's all the an African black and they within that community they judge each other, and within our community we judge each other too, because there's a legacy that we're very proud of. Like, we're not just Asian American, we're Korean American, and our parents emphasize we're Korean American because within our own history and my parents' history, there's a lot of pride, and there's also a lot of hate and prejudice and bias against Chinese, Japanese, East Asians, everyone. And so that actually colors into it. So when you're in America, people just broadly say Asian. But when we see it, we're like, oh, it's specifically elderly Chinese people in Chinatown or whatever. And we're like, we don't have a problem. It's not us. We don't have an issue. And so we don't stand up to look out for others within the community. We're very insular. And I would also even say, as a pastor, even in churches, and I'm putting religion into this, even we're supposed to be people that fight for it and stand for it and be a bridge, which some churches have been doing and calling forth. But also at the same time, there are some that don't and remain insular and stay within our own. And so I do want to share that piece in that way.
Yeah, no, that was good to mention, right? Because like I think for both the panelists here and for the viewers, at home or wherever they may be in the virtual plane, I think that's important to know, because it's kind of like, oh, well, that's them. Like, so it's fine. Not realizing that if someone's going to be, a white nationalist, a racist, or whatever, to them, we all look the same, right? They don't, they don't see you build, be like, no, he's Korean, I'll leave him alone. They don't look at me and be like, like she's that, like, next one. Like they don't do that. When they see us, they group us together. And because of the amount of hatred, animosity, all that stuff that's perpetuated with, white supremacy, for them, it's like, well, you're the target. I'm going to go for you. So it is good to mention that kind of idea where it's like, oh, well, it's them. Like we're fine. And it also, I think it goes on a broader scale, because I'm thinking about stuff globally too, where it's like, oh, well, that's happening in that country. So that's happening with those people over there. So it has nothing to do with us because nothing's happening over here. Not realizing those very same things could happen here or come over to here because it's getting so bad in this area with this group, with that town, whatever it may have you. Yeah. So I'm gonna switch to the next question, but I think it might have to do with, I think Eric, you wanted to say something maybe. So the next question is, how do you describe the Black experience and what are the stereotypes? Cheyenne, do you want to take this one over?
Yeah, I was definitely like looking for this one. Like the Black experience is something like what Gareth was saying is you have the Black American, which is native to the US. You have Caribbean, you have Black Caribbean, Black Latinx, Black African. So you have these different layers where some people come in with the pride of their native country and not necessarily considering the fact that because you look like you are Black American, you're going to be lumped in the same category as a Black American. And that is a definite issue, especially when you have conversations like me growing up. I grew up with a lot of people who were Afro Latino, or that were like Afro as in like African, where they would say like, I'm not Black. like I am blank, like I am insert whatever they're from. So that concept of neglecting the concept of Blackness is also a global theme, especially within our own communities. Another aspect of the Black experience is talking about policing. Like the first conversation that I remember having when I was young, and I mean like really young, was not just talk to strangers. My first conversation was how to interact with the police. And it was, say sir or ma'am, just say like yes or no. It's basically, it was how to survive. And this is not even on a matter of me going on a victimizing perspective. It is just the reality of, we already have that notion that's taught into us that we need to be very wary of the police, or that we need to be very self-aware or wary of certain groups of people due to the way that we are already treated. Now, as for like the stereotypes, you have the angry Black woman stereotype. So I'm just going to go on to that one so I can let others talk. As basically the angry Black woman stereotype is the fact it's just gaslighting. It's a gaslighting of us not being able to use our emotions, not to express strong emotions. So not only is this a way of delegitimizing our frustration or rage or despair, it's also another perspective of how are women, like basically the idea of women are hysterical. When you add the word Black to it, it is another layer of oppression, basically. And on an activist or on a political perspective, you probably have noticed the way how certain people vote. There's that expectation that Black women are supposed to vote liberal, that they're only supposed to vote Democrat, and that they need to save us from from the opposing group, which is actually not healthy at all. It's not only not healthy, it actually causes not only generational trauma, it causes distress, but also it causes other underlying health issues of why is it that you are relying on us or on the Black women to get things done right, when it's everyone's responsibility to do what is right. So that is one of the many harmful things that I can say, that not only that is a general Black experience, but the Black woman experience. So I'm just going based off of the Black woman experience.
Well, you made some good points. You did. Gareth?
Since it's two questions, I'm going to answer them two different ways. To describe the Black experience, I would say I have a very ironic pride that I take in terms of like the Afro-American experience. And by Afro-American, I mean all Afro peoples from Canada to Chile. Is that the ironic pride that I take in that experience is that I know for a fact that I will always be the most hated demographic in the eyes of Anglo-America because I can't be deported. You can't send me nowhere. It's like, it's like, where you going to take me? Where you going to send me? You know what I'm saying? So there's that. And then what are the stereotypes? The stereotypes there are a lot of stereotypes, for lack of a better term, positive stereotypes and negative stereotypes. And all of those stereotypes are interchangeable. Like you have the gangbanger stereotype, you have the sexual savage stereotype, and both of those particular stereotypes are very well portrayed via sex culture, via pornography, via rap music, via just popular culture in general. And that is a well-entrenched history of slavery and xenophobia and anti-Blackness from the colonial era, and it still perpetuates till this day. So like the thug culture and the sexual savage culture, those two particular stereotypes are amongst like probably the premier stereotype that Afro-Americans, specifically Afro-American males, face literally on a day-to-day basis. And when people find out that you're not a gang member, they're like, oh my God, like, how are you able to grow up in this neighborhood and not be a gang member, or not have a criminal record, or not be a rapist, or not be this, or not be that? Because, you know what I'm saying? And to even have to explain how or why I don't have a criminal record is insulting. You know, even me, like being a Muslim revert, literally one of the most insulting questions that anyone can ask me is, did you become Muslim in prison? That's literally one of the most insulting things you could ever ask a Muslim Afro-American or a Muslim Latino-American revert. That stereotype literally comes from the mythos, the pseudo-narrative of the life of Malcolm Little, Malcolm X, may Allah mercify him. And the irony is that Malcolm X never became Muslim in prison. He was only a Muslim a year prior to his death. He became Muslim in 1964. He was assassinated in 1965. So even that whole mythos of becoming Muslim in prison, that exclusively comes from the Malcolm X mythos. Because again, it's a known fact that Malcolm X didn't become Muslim in prison. He became Muslim in 1964. He died in 1965. So even that, as bringing religion into the mix, that is something that Muslim Afro-Americans, Muslim Latino Americans, those are stereotypes that we have to face all the time. Being uneducated is another stereotype. When I tell people that I've done lecture presentations at Cambridge University, they either look at me like I'm lying, or they look at me like, how did I sneak in? Type of thing. So it's like, even in terms of the highest echelons of secular education, they think or feel that we are unworthy of being in those spaces. Even in terms of affluence, you drive a nice car. People will look at you like, oh, what is this nigga doing with this car? Who did he steal it from? You have a nice house, or what this nigga doing with a nice house? Like, who did he home invade? That type of thing. You know what I'm saying? All of those type of things. So these, just like the actor, if I'm not mistaken, I think his name is Mashara Ali. He was the actor in Moonlight, playing defense. And he said that, I felt that. It's like we're literally always on the defensive. It's like we always have to, quote unquote, defend our right to humanity. And that alone gives rise to a lot of stress, frustration, PTSD, all those type of things.
No, you gave like a really, you guys said everything now. I'm like, what do I say? No, but but it's true, right? There's a lot of stereotypes involved, like the angry Black woman. Are you educated enough? But there's also kind of like the stereotype kind of within our communities, and talking a little bit more about like the intersection of that, where it's like, if you do talk, like you have an education or you have proper grammar or this or that, it's like, oh, why are you acting white, right? Why are you speaking white? Why are you doing this when it's, and again, it's like that association that being white means that you're educated, you're wealthy, you have property, you know, maybe own a business, like all those other things have been attached to one another or associated with one another and being synonymous when they aren't synonymous. And even like, kind of going back to what like Cheyenne was saying, like growing up, like being taught like how to speak to the police, how to speak to this person, how to speak to that person, learning that my level of emotion has to be really regulated, because that could potentially mean the end of my life or the end of somebody else's life that's around me, right? Learning how to have a low temperament. Those are things that we're taught to have at these, at such young ages, when really that shouldn't be anything that we're worrying about. We should just be able to freely play and do what we got to do and just be children. But we're taught these things that adults think about, or, in essence of how to talk, lower your voice, use proper language, speak to this person this way, right? At these young ages, and having those stereotypes. And then when we don't act that way, right? Let's say we are excited about something and we're loud, right? It's like, oh, this person's ratchet, this person's ghetto, this person's this person's that. Even with kind of touching upon like the quote unquote positive stereotypes, which are like, oh, well, you know how to dance, you know how to sing, you know how to do this. Yes, that's a positive thing to think of as a skill set, but it also could be a negative thing because it's an automatic assumption that you know how to do this thing. I always make a joke that I'm the rhythmless nation, right? because I can't, sometimes I can't catch a beat, right? And everyone's like, oh, but aren't you supposed to know how to dance? Like, you're Black. And I was like, no, aren't you supposed to know how to do this? Like, you're Black. And it's like, no. And I think I'm making the assumption that it could be on the same side with Asian Americans as well. Where it's like, oh, well, you're the stereotype of like, oh, well, you're Asian. Don't you know how to do math? I hate that one. And it's like, no, I suck at math. Why are you asking me? Right? And it's like all these different things where it's like can be thought of as a positive, right? Being good at math, knowing how to dance, knowing how to sing, knowing how to how to be good with finances, whatever the stuff can be considerably good when it's within the context of our own groups. However, when it's coming from other people having this expectation that we automatically know how to do this because of the group that we come from, that's when it becomes like an insult. And it's like, so that's all you think about? It's like, you don't think there's anything more to us than these, quote unquote, positive stereotypes that can be used in a negative way against us, So actually segueing some more into this stuff, because I think we've been doing pretty good with the segue ways. The next question here. Oh, wait, it's supposed to be a slider. Let me click and fix. There we go. Another question we had, I'm going to pull it up in a second because it's not letting me click on the thing that I need to click on to make it work. There we go. So kind of having the conversation about like Ebola versus like COVID-19, right? Like, are there any differences between how the Black community and the AAPI community were treated during these mental health crises, and who is to blame? Because Ebola was like, oh, if you're Black, if you're African, like, Ebola, we're all gonna die 2008 or whatever, right? And then now with COVID-19, it's like, oh, you're Asian, you automatically have COVID, right? Stay away from me. And there's been a lot of physical attacks that have gone on with both of these diseases that have affected the world. So whoever wants to hop on this, by all means.
Yeah, I would say hands down, definitely one of the most insulting epithets, if you will, or anecdotes pertaining to COVID-19 was when this Chinese American White House correspondent, she was pressed, she was confronted by a White House staffer, and they said that COVID-19 is Kung flu. And I was like, I can't believe that someone actually fixed their face to say something like that. And I'm like, because, like, I'll be honest, like, when the person first said it, I laughed. And then I was like, wait a minute. Like, it was like a mixture of hilarity and disgust. Because I'm like, it was just so shocking that somebody would actually say something like that. And I'm like, you can't be serious. Like, somebody actually fixed their face to saying something like that. And I was like literally blown away. And I know that person was very hurt when that person said that to them. Like, there's no way that you're not going to be hurt with someone saying like something like that. And it's like that's something that I would like to like Carla and Billy to speak on, in terms of like things like that. Like, when people say things like that, what does that make you think? How does that make you feel when people like literally blanket an entire demographic of people and blame an entire demographic of people for a disease? Like, because it's I can only assume that it's the same way that Muslims feel when we're blanketly blamed for 9/11. The whole 9/11 issue is a whole nother can of worms anyway. So I just want to get you guys' take on that specifically.
I'll go real quick so I could give Clara more time. I wasn't going back on what you said. You were find yourself laughing and feeling disgusted at the same time. It just reminded me of Dave Chappelle. I love him. He's a great comedian, has great insight. And he was like, he said the same thing. He started cracking up when former President Trump said, it was like, he called it Kung flu. And he was upset because he's like, that's what comedians should say, not the president of the United States. You know what I mean? And so I just want to just throw that in there because, there's a context of humor in anything that's serious that we need to alleviate in the right context. But in terms of, I think this is what I said before, when coronavirus started happening within the US, for the Korean community, like, again, we differentiated ourselves because it's the Chinese virus. And there were some people in the Korean community, they were like, yeah, because, you know, this also layers into the in politics too, where that was associated with communism. And, you know, people in the Korean community, anything that has to do with communism, especially the first gen or the older generation, they're like, no way. And so they were kind of for it. I mean, the younger generation, the more millennials and Gen Zers, we have more of a nuanced understanding of it, and we were offended and we were hurt, as you experienced. But in terms of generational difference, they saw it in very different ways, very, very different ways.
Yeah, I'm glad that you brought that up, Billy, because that is something that, you know, we've said it a few times, I think, but there is definitely, even within the Asian community, right, there is a huge gap between what the older generation thinks and what the younger generation thinks, because also our lived experiences have been different, right? And you know, that's something that I just want to like reinforce, you know, is it's a very it's something that we have to differentiate when we discuss race relations in the US too, because there's a huge gap, and that's something that the younger generation, it causes a lot of tension even within our own families, right? Because we're just like, no, you can't see things that way, or you can't, it's not that, right? And honestly, it takes a lot of conversations, if you're even having them, right? If that's even happening between the younger generation and the older generation within families, because sometimes there's also the language barrier where, you know, speaking for Korean Americans, like a lot of my friends, they understand a lot more than they can speak, right? And so being able to have these conversations, you also need to be able to speak in Korean to a certain extent so that there's an understanding, and that is another, you know, gap to bridge. But I'm going to go back to what Gareth was asking. I mean, you know, how do we feel when those kind of things, you know, Kung flu or the China virus? To be honest, I feel like it's something that is common in the Asian American experience, especially growing up, right? Growing up, I experienced being the butt of jokes, right? Just constantly. And that's like if we want to talk about, you know, I guess maybe stereotypes, you know, I think in American society, it's really common to be like, to just make fun of Asian people. It's common, and that's a common experience growing up. And a lot of Asian American kids like experience bullying, being bullied, right, constantly. And not just, and this is from, it's not just, you know, from white kids. It was from all communities, right? And so sometimes like that tension, you know, of feeling like, you know, going back to the tension between the two communities, it's also some kids have lived experience of just being bullied constantly in school, right? So then when they think about race, they're like, oh, well, it's actually the same. Like, white people treated me like shit, and so did, excuse my French, and so did the you know, sort of the Black community, so did other kids in school. Like, I was bullied constantly. That wasn't my experience. Like, I wasn't constantly bullied, but I did experience, you know, oh, you're from, oh, Korean, what's that? Like, you're Chinese, like it's the same thing, right? It's not, you know, again, we were viewed as a monolith, right? It's not, it's the same thing. We're not Korea, like, don't you guys speak the same language? Like, you guys eat the same food, it's the same thing, right? Go back to your country. So, you know, Gareth, like that, I was actually not surprised when I heard that, because it's like, how many kung fu jokes have you heard? Let's be honest, right? Over like the course of our you know, childhood. We've heard of so many, right? And Bruce Lee, and making fun of how the accent is like, it's constant, right? And it happens even, it just happens often, right? Does that make it okay? It obviously doesn't. And it is, I agree with you, absolutely shocking that it came out of someone's mouth, you know, in the White House, right? And I mean, I wasn't shocked at Trump doing that, but it was, you know, something from a staffer, right, at the White House. And yeah, so that's my response to your question. Like, it's something that's a common experience, and and that's something that I think there needs to be workaround too, right? Like, we do need to constantly, when those things happen, we do need to be like, hey, that's messed up. That's not okay. Like, let's, right, like, move on from this.
You know, I'm so happy to hear, you know, from both you, Billy, and Clara, about your perspectives on this, right? Because, like, I always say that you can't ever understand where somebody's coming from unless you've lived their experience. And I think all of us here have talked about our experiences. And if we know we're making assumptions, we say, like, well, I might be making an assumption, but let me know. And I think that kind of segues into the last thing before we close up, because I know we're on time. Is just like the conversation about, like, you know, what are different ways people can be allies to respective communities, and then there's any advice that you would give to us here or to the viewers about how to be more active in their communities when they see these things happening. Like, what are some things that they can do?
So I can start with this as someone who's done activism for a long time. Is you're going to be uncomfortable learning a lot of the history and a lot of the things that's going on, especially if you're someone that's new and catching these revelations and these epiphanies, that you're going to be very uncomfortable. You might find yourself feeling like you're being irrational and emotional. Like, that's okay, because this is something that is not only new, but this is something that was this is foreign. This is a bit foreign to those who are entering the activism sphere. Constantly learning and having to challenge what you know as a person, because experience is a teacher. It's life's teacher. So having to have things be challenged, and having to challenge yourself, your family, your friends, and people you know, is going to be one of those common things that's going to happen a lot, especially when you're having these conversations. And to not be afraid to learn, because, like, the moment when you think that you're not learned, that you don't think there's anything else to learn, is when you basically stop being a person, like, which is a growing experience. You're growing and you're connecting. So when you feel like there's nothing else that you can learn from yourself or from anybody, you're not living. And that, I guess, is just my quick advice for anybody.
Thank you, Cheyenne. That was some really good advice.
Yeah, I'll just say real quick, because we're finishing up. I would say, listen. Just listen. Talk to people that are not like you, and listen, and respect even those people that you might not like, with dignity. Like, if you're a liberal, have a conversation with an extremely conservative person and just listen. My brother is a strong conservative, so I have to listen in the dinner table a lot. We fight a lot. My parents get uncomfortable, but I learned a lot. And I learned a lot about how insular I was, and I've been. And, you know, that has taught me so much. So I would say listen and give respect.
Thanks, Billy.
I would just say, I would just repeat something that Allah says in the Quran from chapter 5, verse 8. Allah says, and never let your hatred against any people prevent you from behaving justly. So what we learn from this particular piece of revelation is that regardless of how much animosity you have towards a fellow human being, you still have to respect them as a human being. So this gives rise, and it forces us to do two things. One, it compels us to think about the fact that even if I hate this person, I still have to respect them as a human being. And then when we compel ourselves to respect a fellow human being, then it forces us to introspect about the reasons how and why we even hate people. And then 9 times out of 10, once you do that, you'll recognize and accept the reality that at least 90% of the reasons how and why you hate the other is completely unjustified. So that's the only thing that I would say.
Thanks, Gareth. That was good.
I would just add, I think it's really important that we build real, edifying, trusting relationships between our communities. And it's not just, oh, go and make some Asian friends, oh, go and make some Black friends and you'll be good. It's not that, right? That's not the argument here. My point here is that when you have real relationships with people, right, it creates more understanding, it creates more empathy, it closes gaps, right? We as people, we tend to care more about those that are within our circle, right? We care about people who we're in close relationships with. So when we're in these relationships, that just being in the relationship itself creates more of a reason to act. It motivates us to do the actual work of becoming free from internalized depression, free from the lies of white supremacy, and to be anti-racist and just overall, right? I think it's easy to, going back to even insularity, that Billy mentioned that, and going back to what Garrett said about just being wow, I lost my train of thought there. But insularity, insularity is something that prevents that from happening, right? You're not when you're closed and you don't have real relationships, and really the relationship is from behind the cashier and a customer coming in, because that is a reality of like the relationships between our communities in terms of just like when we're talking just like average like experience, everyday experience that people have, that could be a source of tension, right? That's not a relationship or friendship. It's not someone that you might be you care about them, right? It's a transactional relationship that often happens. I really stress the importance of having real relationships with just, Billy mentioned this as well, listen to all different types of people, have relationships with different types of people, because that's what creates more empathy. That's what creates more of a reason for you to listen and to understand and to be like, oh, okay, I see where you're coming from. And yeah, that's it. There's so many other things that you can do. I think the last thing I would just say is to get connected to your local community-based organization. They are the ones on the ground doing the work. They're in the trenches. They are fighting the fight every day. And if you're not connected to them, you honestly don't know. And it's really easy to go just kind of about your everyday, because let's face it, like, we're busy, we have responsibilities, and we're living our lives, right? But if you're not connected to these organizations, it's really, I think it's hard to keep your mind and your focus on caring about what's happening to our communities or between our communities. So yeah, there's so many in New York. Get connected to those organizations and see how you can help out, and not just in a volunteering capacity. Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much for all you guys taking out your time, because to me, time is precious. And I feel like maybe we've used this time today to hopefully educate people, educate ourselves, have a better understanding from the perspectives that each of our groups come from, and just kind of to reiterate / solidify a lot of things that all of you guys mentioned. This is not get an Asian friend, get a Black friend, you're good to go. Racism solved, right? Intersectional racism solved, colorism solved, all these things are solved, right? It's really about having the conversation about our experiences and understanding that these experiences are real for these individuals. Because I might have an experience that Cheyenne or Gareth never had, but it doesn't make that experience less real. Same thing with Clara. Clara might have an experience that Billy's never had, but doesn't necessarily make it less real. And I think that's something for us as individual groups, or just as groups coming together, is to remind ourselves that even though I may not have, or I don't know anybody in my circle that have experienced, let's say, discrimination or have seen the fact that they've been discriminated, does not mean that they aren't. And to, again, go into those conversations. That person that you may have been wanting to talk to the whole time, but you're not sure if you should talk to them, just have a conversation with them. The worst they could say is like, get out of my face. The maximum they could do is cuss you out. You'll be fine. I get cursed out a lot for previous jobs. I've gotten over it, so, but again, I really do appreciate all of you guys.
Okay, that's not okay.
But... No, it's not okay. It's not okay. But the problem is that I've had to learn to be okay with it, where it doesn't seep into my heart and I feel like I'm the problem, and just realize, okay, that person was just either having a bad day or something was going on with them, and just, focus on myself. But thank you, Clara. Thank you for reassuring me that wasn't okay, because it wasn't. But there's just the things that you're seeing here. This is a conversation you can have, in your own circles or in other circles that you have. What we're doing right now, you can hop on a Zoom, you can do a video chat, you can have a phone call, you can meet up in person and do the things that we're doing today. And we're going to try to organize a part 2, because there's a couple other questions that we have, but we didn't necessarily have the time to fit them all in. So you may see some of the same faces or some new ones having this conversation. And I want to say thank you to our audience for listening, for paying attention. I hope you guys absorbed a lot of stuff. We will have the PowerPoint available to you. This will be on YouTube and Facebook until either of those systems shut down forever. So it's access to it all the time. So thank you, everybody, and have a good night. Bye.